Professor Farid, Ambassador, first of all, congratulations because your speeches and especially for the book. I'm from Spain, part of the countries involved in the book also. So I have two questions for you around the contribution of Spanish ambassadors. Said before that the Spanish was involved with the Holland at the war when Brazil came here. So if Mr. Ambassador could develop something about that, I would be pleased to hear you as a Spanish. And yeah, for you, I also have to say that some people have you before us for more knowledge and more involved in each other country, European, for example, Brazilian or Indonesian. But you have to know that any European also involved now, like me in my case, I'm involved here with 4 universities developing agreement, and I'm here for 21 years because I'm saya orang tua, obviously, orang tua. So yes, after this, I finally want to ask you about this, the contribution of Spain in this book, what you could say, and for Mr. Ambassador, develop this point of the Holland War. And once again, after visiting 53 countries around the world, this is the best Perpustakaan, the best Perpustakaan I have been around. And you have a wonderful university. And so I have to say that because it's amazingly good. And I feel like rumah di sini. Terima kasih banyak.
Yep. What I meant to say is that much that happened in the Brazilian history had to do with what's happening in Europe. The fact that the Dutch went to Brazil had to do with what we call the Iberian Union in our history, when Portugal and Spain briefly became a single country for dynastic reasons. But that was a good excuse for the Dutch, who were eyeing Brazil for quite a while to go there. For example, not many people know that because of the Napoleonic wars in Europe, the Portuguese royal court and the Portuguese king went to Brazil. And for a while, Brazil was the seat of the Portuguese Empire. And later on, when we became independent, what was happening in Europe and much later what was happening in the US affected us. But I think that this is true today even more than it was in the past, because no matter what's going on in the world, affects everybody. But if you, the professor said that we sometimes we have to study our history in other countries or countries from the North Atlantic world, and I remember when I was first studying world history in secondary school, I started learning about, you see, the French Revolution, and I wonder why that was a starting point for me. You see, well, to a certain extent, I understand that eventually, you see, Napoleon, you see, after the Bourbons were went to the guillotine, and then Napoleon invaded Portugal, and that. But you see, there are other perspectives. History is very rich. There are different ways of looking at it. They are not necessarily better or worse, but you see, there are different ways of looking at it. And now I think that the good thing that's happening to us nowadays is that we are trying to understand the world from our perspective, not from someone else's perspective. Did I answer your question? Okay. Thank
you. If I can just add to that question about where's Spain in all this, yeah, that's the other interesting thing, because I'm not really a historian of 18th century Southeast Asia. I'm a historian of 19th century Southeast Asia. And the 19th century was a great century for the publishing industry because all aspiring colonial powers wanted to publish books. There's tons of books coming out in the 19th century. But what is interesting is that it coincides with a kind of ethno-nationalism that emerges in Europe by that time, where colonialism is driven by nationalism. And this is a mistake, I have to say, unfortunately, in many parts of the colonized world, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, perhaps, but certainly in Asia, where there's sometimes this tendency to say all Western powers. You forget one thing, these Western powers are actually rivals as well. Yeah. So I'll give you an example. A much later book, Stanford Raffles' History of Java, that was published in 1817. On the one hand, you can read the history of Java as a history of Java. But when you read it closely, Raffles is really nasty towards the Dutch. Half the text is just about how useless Dutch colonialism is compared to British colonialism, make Britain great again. So it's all about the Dutch. They don't know how to run a colony. They don't know how to make a profit. So half the text, it's supposed to be a book on Java, but half the text is actually just bashing the Dutch nonstop. And when you read Neuhoff, it's the same thing. It's, he's a Dutchman, but he's worried about Portugal and Spain in Latin America. So these works, although they are about Brazil, they're about Java, they're also about Europe. They're also about Europe. And to go back to Ambassador's point, one book I recommend, since you mentioned Napoleon, is Paul Fragosi's excellent book, Dreams of Empire, Napoleon Bonaparte and the First World War, where Fragosi basically argues that the Napoleonic Wars were in fact a world war because they were fought everywhere, from South America all the way to Java. Britain's invasion of Java takes place during the Napoleonic Wars. But I would push it even further. For me, the 7 Years' War was the First World War, because it was during the 7 Years' War that Britain invaded Philippines, because Britain and Spain were at war. So the wars of Europe get exported to Asia and Africa, right? So we can actually keep going back, in history, and the question rises, which is the actual First World War? Is it the 7-Year War? Was it the 30-Year War? The 80-Year War, where the Dutch are fighting for independence from Spain, And this is the thing that created the Dutch East Indies Company. It was created to finance Holland's struggle to become an independent country. But as a result of that, Holland also becomes an empire. So all these things are interconnected. And I think the great thing about history is it's messy. And neat histories, I think, are dangerous. When you want to have simple, linear histories, historians will actually tell you that history always overlaps, interconnects. And that's also why history is important, because it informs us about what's going on today so that we have a better understanding of what's going on today. So in answer to your question, where is Spain? Where all the European countries are there. They're always in the background. They're always in the background, because when a Dutch man goes out, when a Portuguese man goes out, when an English man goes out, he's going out not only to Asia, not to Africa, not to South America, but he brings with him the memory of Europe, and he brings with him all these political considerations of the conflicts in Europe. And it's all about leverage all the time. And later on, of course, when the two latest empires emerge, Japan and America, they too do the same. Because in the 19th century, there's only one game in a town, and the game is imperialism. So you want to rise and become someone, you have to have colonies, because that's the way. Now, that was our reality up to the mid-20th century. But like what we've been saying today, we now live at this particular juncture of human history. The countries in the South can rethink this and perhaps search for other ways of knowing themselves and knowing one another. And I hope that we will take that opportunity.